Welcome to Tea Time, my friends, a place where I muse about my gender transition experience and in the process aim to comfort and inspire others to a greater level of self-awareness. I am Artemis, enjoying an iced cup of blueberries and cream tea, courtesy of the Rose and Vine Gift Company. And in this video, I'm very excited to announce the first successful public engagement event I organized for Florida for Tea Time. What's doubly spectacular is that it came just as the advocacy group Equality Florida issued a travel warning stating that due to recent legislation, the state was no longer deemed safe by their standards for LGBT individuals. But as you'll see in this video, I found a city government in this state, and more to come, who are more than happy to support those within the community who offer mutual respect and responsible conduct. After I detail the successes of the event, I'm also going to go through 4 pieces of legislation specifically cited by this group as inflammatory and the reason for their judgment, picking through the sensationalism of media coverage to find what the bills are literally saying, and perhaps what may be worth keeping an eye on. A link to that news coverage video will be in the description box below, as well as links to all 4 bills I will be discussing and a particular statute of importance. If you've just come for the logical breakdown of the legislation, that will be in a timestamp in the description box below as well. At the very least, what I would want for you to know is that despite what the advocacy group and legacy media may want you to believe, I've experienced nothing but support from governments here. I believe this cooperation is due to offering, not forcing, my opinions on others in tandem with empathy for their experience of me and the concept of transgenderism. That note is a great segue into how I pitched my idea to my local city event organizer. I wanted to create a space that was inviting for members of the community to approach me and have an opportunity to air any and all of their emotions, comments, or questions in a judgment-free atmosphere. With the help of my wife, who designed the booth, a picture I'll be showing here on the screen, we went for an afternoon tea with friends sort of look, and I sent the design for inspection as well as an abstract of our intention to that city coordinator. We were immediately received well by that event coordinator and invited to join an outdoor farmers market on the first Saturday of each month. When the day of the event came and we were setting up, several other vendors came to compliment the look of the booth and, after seeing the banner, praise us for being available to the public for such a goal. And during the event itself, while there were several people who sheepishly avoided eye contact as I wished them good morning, there were others who gave passing compliments like, "Thank you for what you're doing." There were 3 people in total during that 4-hour event who sat down in the chair to talk. One was a middle-aged gentleman who expressed interest in learning about the transgender experience, even though he himself couldn't relate, because he simply wanted to be a more learned individual. Another was a young female who supported the LGBT community whilst in the stages of learning about her own sexuality and identity. And the last to sit down was a young detransitioned female. We exchanged our personal stories, and I was able to validate her feelings on what she had been through and provide her with some perspective. She left the interaction stating that she felt a weight had been lifted from her, and I was greatly appreciative of having the opportunity to help in one of the ways that I had aimed to with these events. It was a moment that I will always remember and keep as a reminder to continue these efforts. I had hoped to be able to record these conversations candidly with their permission to share here on this channel, but due to our state laws, no audio can be taken without express written permission from the participant, and because it's impossible for me to avoid ambient audio at current, and therefore potentially an unwilling patron's conversation, I cannot record at these events. In the future, though, I hope to get people who will be willing to sit down in private at a different time for commentary. After the event had taken place, there were 2 complaints lodged with the city regarding my presence. The event coordinator mentioned that we hadn't broken any laws, and they were pleased with our conduct, so they handled the complaints professionally and asked if I wanted the feedback just for good measure. Ever curious, I inquired. The first was a father who said he was confused that the farmers market was billed as a family-friendly event, and he did not see my presence as being family-friendly. He said that he would feel uncomfortable explaining to his child what transgender meant if they had seen my banner, which reads, "I'm transgender, let's chat." I should also say that in order to keep with the purpose of a farmer's market and not just to solicit conversation, we offered for sale the teas that my wife makes that I sip for each video. Just instead of advertising her business, we advertised my YouTube channel instead. In considering this father's perspective, I tried first to sympathize with him. I can see if I were trying to bullhorn blast sexual information to anyone passing that indeed this would be inappropriate for family audiences in many eyes. However, if the criteria for family friendly is just that you need to be comfortable with your child's questions on anything that may be seen in a public place, then much debate could be had about what may even be allowed with all the differing opinions. Many would consider topics of religious context to be family friendly, such as a display selling baked goods for a church with a banner that says, "Jesus loves you." But I can imagine that being uncomfortable territory for parents who do not agree with whatever religious message is on display. Yet another example could be a farmer's market that advertises the sale of halal-compliant meats, which may indeed prompt from a child a very uncomfortable question to answer. This father may be under the impression of transgenderism created by the larger media, which is that the LGBT or trans community is trying to spread an ideology and indoctrinate children. My presence would then seem like a threat to him, so I can empathize with him on that. Another reason I've begun doing these public events is to directly oppose this bad press, not to excuse the behavior of tyrannical activists or narcissistic behavior, instead to represent a rational and compassionate side of those technically within that label. As a last note to ponder, I'd like to point out that this father had another option available to him in handling my presence, which was to decline explaining if his child asked about me and my banner. It's common for people to resort to trying to control other people in order to preserve their feeling of safety versus creating it within themselves. One thing to keep in mind is that this father could have had an opportunity to personally supervise his child's education on this topic, but instead chose to leave his child's exposure to another time when perhaps he wasn't present. It's possible that this father's discomfort was telling of something unaddressed within himself on that subject, which could be used as an opportunity to grow and be a more educated parent. Instead, what we see is the choice to turn away from uncomfortable feelings, an attempt to control someone else's peaceful presence in public, and leaving a child uneducated on a topic that could easily still reach him or her through the internet and peers, without his guidance, potentially causing trouble in personal development. I see these choices and situations as very common, and I empathize with their difficulty. In shining a light on them, I simply hope to encourage introspection. The second complaint received was directly in line with my concern of the condemning blind tribalism, which I'm attempting to soothe. This gentleman was a vendor at the market who labeled himself a conservative Christian. He threatened to pull his booth and patrons if I were allowed to stay, stating that he would not support a market who wished to allow the indoctrination and abuse of children. He had no idea what I was actually there for, and immediately associating transgender with exposure of minors to sexual themes and medical misinformation. I believe the saying goes, you can lead a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. I make myself present for anyone who wishes to engage, but I do not attempt to force information or my opinion. If this gentleman had approached me even with a hostile comment, I treat those moments as an opportunity to empathize. I believe that oftentimes this aggressive behavior is rooted in fear, and if you can create a sense of safety, a far more positive impact can be made. It doesn't always work, and I don't always recommend it for every scenario, but knowing how to keep your own internal boundaries and having a robust understanding of human psychology goes a long way to keeping a peaceful life, and I try to share that where possible. I plan to resume these events much later in the year and take a break over the summer, as I don't think trying to talk about such heated subjects makes a great pairing with 95-degree temperatures and humidity here in Florida. The combination is reminiscent of peanut butter and pickle juice. Now, onto the portion of the video where I break down the legislation that is supposedly unfriendly to the LGBT community. In the news story I am referencing, Brandon Wolf, Press Secretary of Equality Florida, mentions 3 specific bills that he claims are a threat to the LGBT people who are visiting for any length of time or relocating to the state. Before I get into the details of each bill, I think it's important to mention that Wolf says some of the representatives who made disparaging comments about LGBT people are not representing their constituents and therefore should be removed from office. Now, while I found the comments made by the referenced representatives to be less quality than I would expect of professionals, I do not expect them to represent my views particularly. There's a reason there are multiple representatives that make up the House and the Senate, because inevitably there will be opposing viewpoints that cannot logically be represented by one individual. It's the basis of reasoning for the multi-party political system that we have. Those representatives that do not resonate with Wolf surely resonate with other voters, and their opinions are supposed to count in a democracy too. This myopic viewpoint in reporting seems common in legacy media, which continues into their misleading coverage of the bills mentioned and deemed proof of aggression towards the LGBT community, as we will soon see. The first bill, labeled by politicians as the Safety in Private Spaces Act, Bill number 1674, prohibits the use of restrooms, locker rooms, changing rooms, and shower rooms for anything other than your natal sex. This applies to correctional facilities, charter schools, private schools, colleges, public education institutions, and public buildings owned and operated by the state. That's going to be important in a minute. The bill defines female as one whose reproductive system produces eggs and a male as one whose reproductive system produces sperm. It defines sex as a combination of what your genitals are, your chromosomal makeup, and naturally occurring sex hormones. This ends the legal debate for now as to what defines male and female, and these are terms to be used in legal proceedings versus the words man or woman. The bill allows unisex restrooms to be exempt, as well as in situations of chaperoning children under 12, assisting an elderly or disabled person in medical emergencies, or janitorial services if no one of the opposite sex is present, and for those with medically verifiable intersex conditions. It also allows for use of an opposing restroom if your restroom is not in operation and no one of the opposite sex is present while you're in there. I did an extensive video titled What to Do, link above, if you'd like a load more on the moral and philosophical conundrums that surround this pile, because it's too much to dump here. While the advocacy groups would claim this bill is hostile, here's the punchline that, in my opinion, lays that viewpoint to waste. You can only be penalized if you both willfully enter the opposite sex bathroom and refuse to leave when asked by a faculty member of the institutions outlined. Meaning, if no one can tell from the outside that you're not the sex you claim, likely nothing will happen. Also, if someone from the faculty asks you to leave and you comply, there's no legal issue there either. If you're making a concerted effort to keep yourself covered, be respectful of others' viewpoints, get in, do your business, and get out, again, there's no issue. Further, this bill does not cover private businesses like restaurants, amusement parks, or department stores. Simply in places like prisons where males have identified as female and were housed with females, leading to serious consequences. Even with that, this bill does not state that an offender would be carted off to criminal charges immediately if discovered in the wrong restroom or changing facility. They have to enter, be discovered, and then refuse to leave once asked. Sounds a bit like a politically correct Mission Impossible, doesn't it? The way I see it, society operates based on the common majority for optimal functioning. If someone who is outside the majority wishes to be accommodated, the best way to do that is to start with being empathetic and respectful of that majority. While millennia have been spent teaching us that those who are on the outskirts can be treated brutally, I believe we are at a place in the evolution of consciousness that this trend is changing, and as such, applied empathy would go a long way to achieving cooperation. Establish respectful relationships and behave with integrity. Exemplify how you would like to be treated. It's called the Golden Rule because the results have proven throughout history, despite the brutality towards difference. These bills are being proposed and passed because there are real consequences observed from, let's face it, mostly particular biological males who exhibit extreme narcissistic behavior and abuse under the guise of transgenderism towards biological females. The bills are not explicitly hunting and penalizing transgender individuals for simply trying to cope with their position. They just don't allow for blatant disregard of the majority. The second bill, House Bill 1223, prohibits the use of pronouns that are not in accordance with natal sex and requires that no one be forced to use a pronoun that does not match natal sex when referring to someone else in public school institutions. It further elaborates that no punishments are to be threatened by the institution if someone chooses to use pronouns when referring to another that is natal sex based. It also prevents staff from prompting this information from others or staff from giving their preferred pronouns to students. Lastly, it prohibits the teaching of sexual themes to pre-K through grade 8, and if it's offered from grades 9 through 12, like for sex education, it must be in accordance with state standards. State standards, according to the state statutes, in addition to education on acquired immunodeficiency virus, reads as such. A. Teach abstinence from a sexual activity outside of marriage as the expected standard for all school-age students while teaching the benefits of monogamous heterosexual marriage. B. Emphasize that abstinence from sexual activity is a certain way to avoid out-of-wedlock pregnancy, sexually transmitted diseases, including acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, and other associated health problems. C. Teach that each student has the power to control personal behavior and encourage students to base actions on reasoning, self-esteem, and respect for others. And D, provide instruction and material that is appropriate for the grade and age of the student. I can see how this bill could be perceived as hostile by an LGBT adult individual who needs their pronouns to be used by juveniles they are tasked with educating. I did an extensive video on pronoun usage, link above, but the short version is that those who need their identity reflected back to them in the form of mandated preferred pronouns lack a solid sense of self. Those who need this from those younger than them, whom they are supposed to be mentoring, is a cause for concern, in my opinion. Additionally, the current science shows that the human brain is not fully mature until one's mid-20s, and so sharing advanced introspective identity topics to children for consideration can be a precarious situation. The bill is attempting to keep discussions of personal nature out of the classroom curriculum, as is expected of professional careers, to maintain neutrality, and away from the individuals of an age who clearly do not possess the reasoning ability to handle it. It also protects free speech by forbidding punishment of those who do not wish to use pronouns in a manner other than their original intention, which is based on natal sex. And by pronouns in that way, I'm referring to those of he, him, or she, her. The students are able to discuss among themselves and do as they please in their exploration of self, so the bill is not forbidding or demonizing this. If students express confusion on their identity, their parents are to be alerted for additional support, per the supposed Don't Say Gay bill, actually called the Parental Rights in Education Act. Link above for the coverage I did on that. For anyone who wishes that the institution had the ability to teach sexual themes to children, including gender identity and pronouns, I have these questions for you to ponder. How can you be sure that the teacher or school is delineating an ideology that is in line with your own? Why would you want to leave that responsibility to someone else instead of yourself? What if the school had the authority to teach on these topics and the statutes were changed to things that you did not agree with? In that case, the school has the right, not you as the parent. To further that point, the statutes I read earlier that define sex education lean heavily in the direction of conservative Christian values, which are abstinence before heterosexual, monogamous marriage. These are themes that not everyone agrees with. It seems to me that the state believes this to be the most optimal strategy for what they deem a healthy society, and I'd guess that there's research out there to support this belief. Again, though, it does alienate the non-heteronormative students and fails to provide support to those teens who are going to be sexually active regardless of what they are told. In a sense, the institution is failing to follow through on their own statute, which is to quote-unquote provide instruction and material that is appropriate for the grade and age of the student. What is appropriate for one student may be traumatizing for another. Further, they list that they should teach that each student has the power to control personal behavior, quote unquote. But nowhere in the course on sex ed is there an entire section on how actually to psychologically and therapeutically control yourself. And really, how successful can one expect that practice to be when you're talking about a group of individuals whose frontal cortex in the brain, where all logic and reasoning happens, still has about a decade to finish developing? This fact is even supported in our judicial system, where those under 18 in most cases who commit crimes are not to stand the same judgment as adults. State-sanctioned services like public education are by default going to alienate minorities in an attempt to accommodate the majority, to the best of their ability or their agendas. The responsibility falls on the parents to know their children and fill in the gaps in their education, or better yet, perhaps, homeschool them entirely. To drive that point home, the statute says only to teach on the benefit of monogamous heterosexual relationships and abstinence, but provides nothing for the discussion on homosexuality. As in, the teacher is not supported to demonize or actively discourage anything that isn't monogamous heterosexuality, and in fact could still present it as a phenomena that occurs. This to me shows that there is no blatant hostility towards the LGBT community, instead just a lack of support. However, do you trust the teacher not to impart his or her beliefs onto the students if the questions are asked? Do you trust the teacher to refer the LGBT student to the school counselor for additional support where they are not allowed to speak? Parents have a tremendous amount of influence over their children by evolutionary biological design. By knowing your child and staying involved in their life, you can provide the support, the answers, and the confidence when and where they need it. No statute required. The last bill seen on this slide in the newsreel is HB 1423. It declares no admittance of children to adult live performances, and no liquor to be served at these shows where children are present. An adult live performance is defined as any show, exhibition, or other presentation in front of a live audience which, in whole or in part, depicts or simulates nudity, sexual conduct, sexual excitement, or specific sexual activities as those terms are defined in section 847.001. Lewd conduct, or the lewd exposure of prosthetic or imitation genitals or breasts, when it 1. Predominantly appeals to prurient, shameful, or morbid interest, 2. Is patently offensive to prevailing standards in the adult community of this state as a whole with respect to what is suitable material or conduct for the age of the child present, and 3. Taken as a whole, is without serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value for the age of the child present. The language in here definitely relies on a subjective moral code, which leaves room for interpretation. What I believe they are doing with their definitions is allowing for scientific displays or demonstrations of educational nature for sexual reproductive purposes, and all else is considered inappropriate. Introduction for the age. This definition of adult live performance should sound familiar to anyone wishing to ogle and objectify other humans, because it applies to strip clubs too. The bill seems like it's targeting drag shows because this is where children are now more increasingly being exposed to sexual themes, where to my knowledge before there were not many people who thought bringing a kid to a strip club was a wise idea. If it were targeted to drag shows specifically, the language would include something like biological males impersonating characters meant to be feminine in nature, to include wearing of prosthetic parts, painting of the face, etc., etc. Tennessee's recent SB 0841 mentions specifically male and female impersonators, while also maintaining the performance must be of sexual nature in order to be illegal. So, while Tennessee's language targets drag performers specifically, it also stipulates that the show must be of sexual nature, not simply just the explicit cross-dressing. I can see a performance of a male playing a female being of educational nature to a child. It happens all the time in theater acts on Broadway, generally to be considered tame in nature. Again, the problem seems targeted to the explicit sexual nature of the show. If a drag show cannot be performed without displaying real or fake genitals and sexual activity or allusion to sexual activity, then what purpose is it serving to a child not deemed old enough for sex education? Honest question. If a male wants to put on a wig, makeup, and a dress and sing Dancing Queen, there is nothing in the Florida bill, or even in the Tennessee bill, that stops him, so long as he refrains from sexual themes. If drag, genitals, and mimicking sexual acts are inseparable, then the state says children cannot be present. They say the same for stripping and alcohol, too. If drag can be performed without sexual themes, Florida currently says you're A-OK to do this with minors present. To me, this sounds considerate of all parties involved. There's one more bill I'd like to add here that was recently passed and not listed in the news video, which is Senate Bill 254. There are multiple things this bill accomplishes, but there are just a few key points I want to discuss due to the hot misrepresentation I've been seeing in the media about it. The first provision makes it illegal to give, quote-unquote, sex reassignment prescriptions and procedures to those under 18 years of age. I'm going to pause and expand on this because the definition of the phrase in quotes is precisely what is misrepresented by those opposed to the bill, and one shining example of why I am such a stickler for concise language. Activists wishing to paint this in a bad light report that the bill outlaws gender-affirming care, which would include mental health therapy alongside medical interventions. The bill uses the term sex reassignment prescriptions and procedures, not gender-affirming care, and defines what they are outlawing as the administration of so-called puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries that alter the reproductive potential to those under 18. It says absolutely nothing about blocking mental health therapy or other social measures to explore and alleviate issues relating to gender identity discomfort. By focusing on the term gender-affirming care, rather than using the legally defined term, those opposing the bill misrepresent what is actually being outlawed in order to garner more sympathy for their position. Their position is to be allowed to administer drugs that have been proven to cause irreversible reproductive harm in many cases, as well as perform surgeries that often remove the ability of someone to reproduce, or at least hamper it in some way, to a minor under the age of 18 who claims they need it. This is someone who is not yet even trusted to drink alcohol or vote because they've been deemed unable to make logical choice. And there is science to back this up, as I've already mentioned. One thing I will concede is that this portion of the bill does take away parental rights in being able to pursue transsexual medical care for their child that they have deemed appropriate and needed. Parental rights have been a central focus for Ron DeSantis, current governor of Florida, in his recent bills concerning LGBT issues. And here the government is stepping in to decide what is healthy and what is not in allowing those rights. This, for me, definitely gets into murky territory. At the end of the day, someone will be victimized, and the prevailing solution to this conundrum is simply to victimize as few people as possible and ensure the physical continuation of the species. I think this is a rough realization to come to terms with, and one that will not change without massive shifts in consciousness, in my opinion. For now, we are bound by the extent of what we know and the nature of our being. We know that puberty blockers carry a high risk of sterilization and other developmental permanent damage when given to minors, and surgeries like mastectomies and hysterectomies are irreversible. We also know that minors cannot make those kinds of life-altering decisions with high levels of confidence, as indicated by studies on brain development. And based on this, I can see utility in instituting law to ensure that this knowledge benefits the majority, whether they are educated of it or not. The bill still allows for transsexual treatment to those over 18 versus the alternative of outlawing it entirely. It also provides for transsexual treatment of those with currently verifiable intersex conditions under 18, such as those with ambiguous genitalia, chromosomal defects. Just as we have learned to test for chromosomal information, in the future there could be tests that verify other intersex conditions, such as my propositioned physiochemical sex that I've mentioned in other videos. With this greater understanding, more revisions to law and societal standards can be made. Until then, I find this to be an attempt at creating balance between liberty of individual choice, available knowledge of health, and the victimization that law inevitably creates. Another provision of the bill that has been misrepresented by media sources is that the state can take temporary custody of children threatened with medical sex reassignment treatment, but they can do so only if the child is abandoned. I've seen claims that the state wants to be able to take children from parents if they find the child threatened by transsexual procedures. If this were true, I would find it frightening that a government would move to such power. However, my word-for-word reading of the bill is that this is not the case. Again, I'm not a lawyer, and this is just my interpretation of what I read in the bill language. I'm linking to all the bills below so you can read it for yourself. Lastly, the bill requires that anyone over 18 receiving sex reassignment prescriptions and procedures must be given literature on the risks of their treatment, aka informed consent, and sign off that they received it. This goes a step further to ensure that even if someone did not exercise due diligence for the treatment they were about to receive, the provider must at least expose them to this information. This addresses the experience of many detransitioners who claim that they were not told of the potential consequences, and had they known, they may not have proceeded. It helps to protect and support the age group of 18 to 25-year-olds allowed by law to undergo the treatment, but those whose capacity to reason is still developing. At current, again, I find this to be a compromise given the nature of human beings on average, between what we know and freedom of choice. As always, I welcome discussion in the comment space below, and until next time, cheers.